Hey everybody, Tim Anderson here, aka Renfell. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into Babylon 5 and why I think this is a masterclass in storytelling and why I think J. Michael Straczynski is one of the best storytellers of the 20th and 21st centuries. Just my opinion, of course, but he's done a lot of cool stuff beyond just Babylon 5, working with the Wachowskis on Sense 8, also Jeremiah, which is a brilliant show, a lot of other cool stuff, comic books, screenplays, etc. The guy's had a very good career. Babylon 5 was one of the biggest portions of that. We're going to dive into that today. If this is your first time here, welcome aboard. Hopefully, you'll like this video, and by the end of it, you'll smash that like button, join the channel, subscribe, hit the bell icon, all those good things so that you get updates like this in the future. I do lots of different things on YouTube, so check the playlists out. There's video games, books, movies, shows, cooking, a weekly vlog on Mondays, the Discord channel, there's a Patreon page, whole slew of stuff, so dig in, check all of those stuff out. Let's head over to talk about Babylon 5. There is a really good article. It's really long. We're going to be skimming through this a little bit and also diving into the wiki today. But over on Tor.com, and I will have this linked down in the description below for those of you who want to go do a deep dive. This article from back in 2019 talking about how Babylon 5 is the greatest and most terrible of science fiction shows, which just goes to say that there's a lot of really cool elements at play here, but ultimately also a few tropes and other things that make it tricky. One of the biggest things here is that this was one of the first, if not, it's definitely, let's just say, one of the first successful examples of a show that had a multi seasonal story arc that played out over its multiple seasons, which was something that was not common at the time and hadn't really been done successfully up until this point. It also is one of the few shows that had an individual helming the show who handled almost all of the writing. Straczynski wrote 92 of the 110 episodes, including all 44 episodes of the third and fourth seasons, which, as the wiki says, was a feat never before accomplished in American television. It also featured a cast of other writers who contributed, like Peter David, Neil Gaiman, etc., DC Fontana, and of course a slew of supporting actors who came on this show when their careers were just getting going. Some of the things that I love the most about this show is the fact that, above and beyond the storytelling, which it's really hard to fathom someone creating a multi-seasonal arc to this level of detail. And I don't want to dive into all of that in today's episode because if you go into the production details over on the wiki and beyond, you'll see just how sort of anal retentive the production was, and it had to be because they were doing things on an extreme budget, and having things planned out that far in advance means that there wasn't room for a lot of changes to be made, and scripts had to be locked down, I think something like 6 episodes in advance, and changes couldn't be made after that point because you got to keep moving. um, from a storytelling perspective, that's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to do that as a writer, but it's also very difficult to do that when you're juggling not just the writing, but also dealing with the world of television and actors and people dropping in and out of projects. And one of the cool things that Straczynski talks about is that every character had a trapdoor built in so that if that actor needed to leave for whatever reason, they could find a way to write them off of the show without it being a hugely detrimental thing, even though these were all main characters. The other thing that I love going on here is the amount of world building that went into this, especially when you start talking about the complications between Londo and Jakar, two of the main characters here, who were from respectively the Narn race and the Centaurs. And I just, to this day, I love just listening to the way Londo talks to Jakar and Jakar, and this is his accent and everything. And the way that their two races had this animosity and just the way that played out over the season of them being enemies and friends and so on and so forth. Really great character writing going on, script writing and everything else. But from a world building perspective, I think that's one of the biggest takeaways for me is what went into Jakar creating this. You've got all the complications of all the races. You've got the political aspect going on. You've got the fact that you've got the psionists, is basically the characters with abilities who become slaves of the human population, and then you've got the time travel aspect, and then the big baddies from the future, or from the past, excuse me, who are also maybe from the future. And there's lots of different stuff going on there and how that plays out over the first few seasons. But then there's other stuff that happens over the last couple of seasons. There's a ton of complex aspects going on here. And they've got a good section here in this Tor article about talking about Babylon 5 also having, all these things like complete pre-planned serialized story arc when it was not common to do so, a bisexual second in command, and a nod to legalized gay marriage all the way back in 1994. A whole bunch of crazy stuff. The fact that that still went on for nearly 2 seasons after the big baddie was destroyed, and still having a very good storyline, despite the fact, excuse me, that some of it was not that great, which is always going to happen when you have a long story. It also won a couple of Hugos, and all this other stuff. But the question that comes up with this article is, aside from the novelty of the show and the fact that it did all these really cool things in the 90s, was it really any good? And there's some caveats here in the article about how Babylon 5 is not a straightforward recommendation, and that's because of the fact that there are a lot of things that the show did really good, but there are also things that are bad, and they mention this here. Not just cringy or cheap, but legitimately objectively awful or misjudged. Some of those can be written off as a product of the times. You could also look at whether or not there were personal viewpoints from writers being brought into question or from Straczynski's point of views in the world. But overall, this is a show that the takeaway is that it's a very, very, very good show. Um, I would consider the fact that the cast is one of the strongest points of this show, and that all starts with the writing of the characters, but also getting the right characters to play their roles. And these are some amazing character actors. In particular, Andreas Katsulas as and Peter Jurasik as the Ambassador Londo and Jakar. I love these two characters, but Delenn's character with Mira Furlan was amazing, and Captain Sheridan just uh, you just can't go wrong with Brooks Boxleitner um, as Sheridan. And that's another one of the weird things here because this is a case of a show where the first season isn't really that good, but the second season is when things get super good, and seasons 3 and 4 in particular are just. Mm. And Straczynski has talked about how, for example, he was very light on certain story elements in season 1 because he didn't want the actors acting out the future of the show. He wanted them acting in the moment, which does make sense, but it also makes season 1 sort of out of place because season 1 has a lot of things that are important later on, but it doesn't really get until season 2 when you start really sinking your teeth into the episodic format of the show and the arcs of everything. Um, there's a lot of great stuff in this article. I would highly recommend everyone going through and reading all of this, especially talk about like peak 90s pop art aesthetic, bargain bin film noir with smoky and dark, grimy shot throughs with bursts of neon and pastels, lounge singers backed by bands with Christmas lights glued to their guitars to make them look spacey. There's a ton of stuff that, despite the fact that the special effects, the special effects in the show were not very good, they did get better as the budget got better. But here's where the one thing: the Babylon 5's production design is inspired, unique, and gorgeous. That is absolutely true. There is some amazing set design and costume design going in here, and combined with the way the actors play their parts is just amazing. However, things do start to become difficult when the fact that there's so many complex storylines weaving together here that it does start to become tricky um, when things start to sort of get towards the end. And they do mention this here is that the show is at its worst visually and atmospherically, but also in terms of writing during the fifth season, even when it had the financial security to look good. But so something was lost in that transition. And there is a certain truth to this. Someone who has said about, if you look at like the Wheel of Times a show as an example, during the first few seasons before they were given those astronomical budgets, the show was all about the characters, and it was all about the actions of the characters and the story and everything else. And then by the time they got into the later seasons, it became these special effects spectacles where the story was being thrown out in favor of special effects. And I do think that that's something that may have had a factor to play in why the later seasons of the show weren't as good as the first seasons. It even says here it loses the fervent passion and becomes workmanship like because the lights have come on and chased the shadows away. Which makes sense considering the little shadows are gone from the galaxy and the wars are over, which was why the fifth season is weaving so many narrative threads, especially with the psychics, the telepaths, the psychics, the psionics, etc. Um, and that is part of the issue with having so many storylines going on is that by the time you get to the end, it does become difficult to put them all together, which is also the issue George R. R. Martin is facing with ever finishing Game of Thrones because he just can't figure it out because he worked himself into this hole where he had too many things going on and now he can't figure out how to get out of that. Um, there is a lot of other stuff here that looking at sort of being naive about certain political aspects, and they do shock about the show could be crassly broad when talking about things such as AIDS, McCarthyism, or Jehovah Witnesses, medical restrictions. Um, but when you get away from that and you dive into the characters and how they're dealing with the complexities of their own empires, like especially with the Centauri and the Narn, and how Jakar and Londo aren't necessarily always in line and in tune with what their own empires are preaching. Even Sheridan not agreeing with everything that's going on Earth and being dictated back, especially in regards to the psychics and everything else. There's so much at play here. This really is one of those shows where you have to dive in and be prepared to go on a journey because it is going to take you a long, long, long way. Now, again, I feel like for me, diving into this show, as much as I love it, I've watched it through twice now. I've debated doing a third time. Not sure if I ever will. I do feel like the first season and the final season are the worst, whereas opposed to season 2, 3, and 4, in my mind, are, if not, it's definitely in my top five, like top five science fiction stories of all time, up there with like the Battlestar Galactica reboot and some other stuff. This is peak science fiction. It's great storytelling. It's great world building. It's great character acting. It's great set design. It's amazing on so many levels. And the fact that they were able to pull this off and that J. Michael Straczynski was able to helm this ship and push it all through with all these various. This is why I just come back to, despite the fact that there are dips in this show, there's also peaks. And when you look at the peaks versus the valleys, there's a lot more peaks than there are valleys. And the end result is a masterclass in storytelling across multiple years and multiple seasons. And I don't think this is something that only applies to television. This is something that can be applied to any sort of uh, book writing as well when you're planning out a good book and looking at all the outline points that you need to be hitting. So many good things. And we could see the story of Babylon 5 has carried on. I remember the first time I played Mass Effect, I went, this is literally Mass Effect is Babylon 5 in a different universe. You've got a big baddie coming back from back in the past, and you've got the different races on a space station dealing with each other, and humans are just coming into the picture, and so many fun elements at play. If you haven't ever watched Babylon 5, I would highly recommend that you do. The reboot is in the works. We're going to talk about that in another video, so stay tuned for that. Hopefully you enjoyed this video by the time I get to the end. If you did like Babylon 5, I'd love to hear your thoughts below. Things you liked, disliked, so on and so forth. This might not be as deep of a dive as other people have done, and you might hear some things here that other people have already talked about, but hopefully overall you enjoyed the video. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, all those good things. Stick around because we got more of the same coming to you soon. Thanks everybody. Don't forget to check the links down below to Discord and our Patreon. We'll see you next time, everybody. Stay safe out there.